Hello and welcome to today's lesson on animal cells. Obviously, this diagram on the screen is not an animal cell. This is just a review of what we looked at last time. So, this is a bacterial cell, and we learned about the four basic parts of bacterial cells, and these same four parts are present in all cells. But this limited number of parts is what makes a bacteria cell what we would say is maybe simple. No offense to bacteria. So here are the four basic parts. We can see there's DNA, and DNA is basically a molecule that contains instructions for making any part of a cell or any process in a cell that needs to happen. The instructions are there, and it's really just floating here in the cytoplasm, which fills up the cell. Now, it's important to remember that this is floating around in the bacteria because when we compare it to animal cells, you'll see that there's a difference. There are these little dots called ribosomes, and these ribosomes have the ability to read the instructions and make proteins. Now, proteins are anything, just about anything in your body is made of different types of proteins. So, your skin, your muscles, or in the case of this bacterium, any part of the cell membrane, anything in its little body is made out of a protein. So, the protein instructions are here in the DNA, and the ribosomes are able to read it and make them. And then lastly, we have a membrane, a cell membrane, and it's basically a layer that surrounds the cell and keeps certain things out and keeps what they it needs to stay in. But it's not an impenetrable barrier. It is something that can let things in or decide to close off. And so for that, we say that it has a selective permeability, meaning that it can let things in or choose not to let things in, or let things out or choose not to let things out based on what it needs. So now we're going to be looking at a diagram of some animal cells, and we're going to see some new features. So here's a diagram of an animal cell, and I know that you're might be freaking out. There's a lot of things labeled. There's a bunch of new parts, but what you need to know is we are not studying 100% of these parts. We're studying a lot of them, but not all of them. And we will go over the big ones step by step, so no worries. Okay. Now, what you'll notice is there's a whole bunch of organelles. Now, those are parts of the cell that have their own membrane. So remember that there's this layer that surrounds the cell. We call a membrane, like its own protective layer. Well, that protective layer surrounds parts inside the cell as well. So if we looked at the nucleus right here, if we look at the mitochondria, if we look at the endoplasmic reticulum right here, all these different organelles or parts have their own membrane, have their own covering, and that protects them, and it keeps what they want inside in and what they want outside out. So the main idea here is that animal cells have parts which bacterial cells don't. They have many more parts. And these parts are more complex because they have their own protective layers to keep certain things inside and the cytoplasm and the rest of the cell on the outside. So let's learn about some of the important organelles, starting with the nucleus. The nucleus is important because it contains the all important DNA. Remember that DNA has all the instructions to make an organism, uh, all the instructions to make proteins and to make up the organism. And before, it was just floating freely around. Well, that's pretty important stuff. If those are instructions to make everything in a cell, would you just want to leave it floating around? No, you would want to protect it. So the nucleus is an organelle or a part that has a membrane, a protective layer, which protects that all important information, that DNA. And every cell in your body has all the information, all the DNA to make up you. But the cells in your bones are not really going to access the information needed to make blood cells, and your blood cells are probably not going to access the information for proteins to make bones. But they actually have all the information. Every cell has all the information. And throughout this video, I'm going to be comparing organelles to parts of factory. And so, by the way, the nucleus would probably be the biggest organelle in most cells, most animal cells. What would we say this would be within a factory? Well, this is where all the information's held. This is where all the instructions are. So we would say this would be like the locked door, because it's protected, of the main office, which has the instructions to run the factory. So if you see, some padlock, some locked door, and here's the main office, that's like what the nucleus is. It contains all the instructions, all the information, and it's kept under lock and key. All right, this is a fun word. This next one is mitochondria. And mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. So they convert nutrients into energy. So just like you, cells need to eat. They need to get nutrients and turn it into energy. And these organelles are specialists in turning and getting energy out of whatever nutrients the cell gets. So if we had to say this was part of a factory, we would say it's like a power plant, which produces the energy for the factory to work. So you could see in a place like this, you might see some smoke coming out. That's because that's where they'd be generating the energy. This is the most fun one to say. This is endoplasmic reticulum. We can just say ER in the future. So the endoplasmic reticulum is all this yellowish, orangish color. And you can see that it has these red dots on them. Well, those dots, if you remember from the last lesson, are ribosomes. So this we actually call the rough ER, and this, the one that has no ribosomes on it, we call the smooth ER. So it will make more sense why there's ribosomes on it when we continue talking about it. So the purpose of an endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER, is to wrap up proteins made by the ribosomes to be sent to the Golgi apparatus. Now, that's just a different part of the cell, so don't worry for right now. So, does it make sense why there's ribosomes there? Sure, because its job is to wrap proteins made by the ribosomes. So, those ribosomes will make some proteins, and this endoplasmic reticulum will wrap them up. So, if we had to talk about the ER as if it were part of a factory, we would say that it's a machine that packages parts to be sent somewhere else in the factory. So, here in this picture, we can see there's a bunch of little parts, a bunch of little proteins that are packaged and separated. And where would they be sent? Well, they'd be sent to something called the Golgi apparatus, which is this green part. Looks like a bunch of pancakes stacked on top of each other, I guess you could say. And the Golgi apparatus is going to receive a bunch of packaged proteins, right? Remember, this is the packaging center. It sends a bunch of little pieces here to the Golgi apparatus. And so it's going to take the little pieces that it's received and combine them and assemble more complex proteins. And then it will take those now complex proteins and it either store them or it will ship them to different parts of the cell or it could even send them outside the cell. Okay? So if this were in the factory, we would say that this is like a robotic arm. So a robotic arm will take different pieces and combine them to make a more complex device. Well, that's what the Golgi apparatus does. It receives all these proteins that are made by the ER, combines them into complex proteins, and then either stores them or ships them off somewhere else. So, where would this, uh, let's say there's a protein that needs to be stored, where would it be stored? Well, there is a storage room of the cell, and that's called the vacuole. So this wasn't in TCI in one of the diagrams. So this is represented by the green blobs. These blobs are basically just storage rooms. So when the cell has extra nutrients, it will store them in the vacuole. And so obviously this would be like a storage room of a factory, like these storage racks. One last thing in a factory, there's going to be some garbage. And if there's garbage, there's got to be a way to get rid of it or to recycle it. And that is the job of something called a lysosome. Now, the lysosome is this orange little ball looking thing here. The lysosome is what it does is it breaks down waste. So they'll put waste in here and it will use some chemicals to break it down into smaller particles. And it can either get rid of it or it can recycle. So we would say that this is the trash and recycling area in a factory. So these workers are going to pick out what can be used by the cell, or they're going to dispose of what can't be used. All right, so those are the major parts of an animal cell, the complex organelles of an animal cell that you wouldn't find in a bacteria. As one last way of talking about these things, we're going to imagine that we're making a protein. So we're going to follow the story of a protein like this one. Now, I honestly don't know what protein this is, and there are millions of proteins, but let's assume that this is a protein that's going to be used to build a cell membrane. And as you can see, there's different parts of the protein represented by different colors. So, what path would this protein take before it gets made? Well, it would start all in the nucleus. Why? Because the nucleus has the DNA, and the DNA are the instructions to make everything, to make all the proteins which make up everything in your cell, which then make up everything in the body. Now, the little dots that can read the DNA are called ribosomes. So you'd have to take that DNA, get it to a ribosome, and it could start making proteins out of it because it can read the instructions and make a protein. And then remember that it goes to the packaging center, it goes to the ER, goes to the endoplasmic reticulum. So the ribosome makes a protein, and the protein gets wrapped up by the ER and sent to the Golgi apparatus. And remember, what the Golgi apparatus does is it takes different proteins, combines them together, makes it into something more complex. So it, it's like that robotic arm that combines everything, and then it has basically two options. So once it's made that complex protein, it will either send it to storage in a vacuole, or it will send it somewhere else. So it could send it somewhere else in the cell, or it could even send it to a place outside the cell. And I hope by using that factory analogy throughout this video that it's helped you understand the different functions of the complex organelles that are found in animal cells but not in bacterial cells. Take care. Have a great day.